Hello, everyone. I'm Trent Jacobs, the digital editor of the Journal of Petroleum Technology here at the SPE. And if you're tuning in today, you're going to be hearing from our very special guest, Greg Leveille, who is the Chief Technology Officer at ConocoPhillips. And before we get into our discussion with Greg, I just want to remind everyone that we want this to be a fun and interactive session. So if you're watching on social media platforms like LinkedIn, let us know where you're tuning in from. Send us in your questions. We're going to try to get to those during a Q&A session at the end of our chat here. And without any more housekeeping items, Greg, I want to thank you for joining us.
Yeah, Trent, thanks so much. It's exciting to have a chance to be on SPE Live, and look forward to our conversation and the questions from the audience members.
Great. Well, Greg, let's jump right into it. You know, this is a unique period in the history of the oil and gas industry that we're all living through. And one aspect of it is that every oil and gas company is having to reassess or reduce their spending when it comes to things like R&D, which really affects our community because we're always thinking about technology. So how has that roadmap changed or not changed for you at ConocoPhillips?
Yeah, so when you think about our technology roadmap, I'd say over the last 3 months when the pandemic's really hit our industry, we haven't changed our direction to any significant degree. But if you look back further in time, there's been enormous changes. It's really been an evolutionary process over maybe the last 6 to 8 years. And if you think about what's happened with our industry, I'd say really two things have really informed how we look at the future and the roadmap for technology. One is recognition of how dramatic the change has been as far as perceptions around hydrocarbon abundance, and also the digital revolution that's going on in the industry. If I say unpack those two a little bit, you think about hydrocarbon abundance, it wasn't that long ago that most technology roadmaps were focused on challenged resources that, frankly, needed significant improvements in cost of supply to be cost competitive. So if you go back to the first decade after the start of the 21st century, that was the focus of most of the R&D in our industry. Today, we are laser focused on trying to take our low cost supply resources and make them even better. So big switch there. And then the other piece I'd say is digital space. I know there's a lot of talk about digital, and it's almost perhaps being overexposed, but we really think that the 2020s is going to be the decade in which digital really comes into its own in our industry. It's almost like the 2010s were the decade of unconventionals. 2020s really going to be focused on digital improvements. And a reflection on that, for ConocoPhillips, 3 of our 4 big technology programs are digitally focused. And the 4th one is really digitally enabled. So a lot of focus in that space as well.
Well, I want to stay on this topic just a little bit longer because, like you said, it is such a big theme, especially since the last downturn. If we think about sort of a lot of the narratives that came out of that, one was that, the industry has to turn towards digital to survive. And so a question that's coming out now, which I think is really relevant, is, what have the prior investments gotten the business? So what did your costs that you already spent on the digital transformation, how are they helping you now during what is widely considered a period of duress?
Yeah, now that's a question I think every company is grappling with, all the members of SPE. I guess I can think of 3 areas which are probably worth highlighting for this conversation. One would be around virtual communication and collaboration technologies, another around automation, perhaps a third one around data analytics. So, if you look at the virtual communication and collaboration technologies, COVID-19 pandemic has really raised the status of having those capabilities inside your company. We are mostly a Microsoft Teams organization, and if you look back prior to the pandemic, we were using Teams to a moderate degree, but we've seen a 6-fold increase in the use of the product. And it's not just using these types of tools to communicate like this. They're not just video conferencing technologies. We're really using this to collaborate across organizational boundaries. So we are now able to basically connect people in various office locations. You might have someone in Alaska, Norway, Houston working together on a particular technology. They can do it real time. They can collaborate, sharing files, modifying files. There's just so much you can do, whiteboards, polling, et cetera, et cetera. So, a huge opportunity for the industry. We've had to learn how to use these technologies under stress, but I think it's going to change the way a lot of things get done. So we're excited about that. In the automation space, with the COVID-19 pandemic having really caused everyone to think about how do we keep people distanced from each other, at many remote locations, we've had to demand the operations. So an operation which might normally have several hundred people on location, might be down to a few tens of people. And we've been really pleasantly surprised by how effective we've been able to run our operations with fewer people on site. And if you think about what's enabling that, a lot of that has to do with the automation technologies that ourselves and other companies have been installing for the last several years. So, the ability to, remotely operate, worked equipment with a minimum amount of human intervention, and have equipment that really is intelligent beyond just a kind of a simple on-off type of choice. So that would be the second one. And then data analytics is very complementary to that. So you think about what's allowed automation to occur at the scale that we've seen here recently. A lot of it has to do with the ability to take data real time, understand what's happening, and make decisions inside the machine, if you will, at a pace that's far faster than what humans could do. So data analytics is an area which is really getting a lot of focus, both in the automation space, but also things like, how do we couple artificial intelligence with some of our traditional physics-based technology. So you think about digital twins, either reservoir simulation of the subsurface or, how a facility operates at the surface. We've been building physics-based models to simulate how the equipment works or the subsurface works. We're now starting to couple that with basically artificial intelligence informed models, and that's making a big difference, Trent.
It's interesting. You gave some examples of sort of, enterprise innovations and then some operational. And I'm curious, I kind of have two questions on that. How do you balance those investments as an organization, where you donate those dollars for digital transformation? And where do you see the bigger ROI? Is it on enterprise worker productivity, or is it the fewer heads per well idea that's generating more value at the wellhead?
Yeah, I think it's kind of across that whole spectrum. If you look at the unconventional business in the lower 48, today I think the industry's drilled somewhere just short of 150,000 horizontal wells that have been hydraulically fractured. Over the next decade, the industry is going to drill many, many hundreds of thousands more. So we're looking at a 4 to 5 times increase in the number of wells. So we're going to have to find ways to manage those type of operations without increasing the size of our workforce. So you think about number of workers required to manage both the placement, drilling, and then operations of the wells. We just got to get better and better with time in order to remain low cost to supply producer. And then, as you mentioned, there's a lot of things that you can scale across an enterprise. One of the things which we're really excited about is that we've been able to put more and more attention on trying to take technologies that have been successful in one place and bring them to other places. So some of the successes that have been achieved with operating centers, for example, in Alaska or Norway in the past, we've been able to bring that information or that technology to our operations in lower 48, and vice versa, been able to take advancements that we've achieved in the lower 48 and port those around the world. So we're moving into a decade which I think is going to be incredibly complex for the industry. Things are moving fast, technology's changing, digital, that can be scaled very quickly once you find solutions that work. And with complexity, I think you just got to get better and better as a company at spreading technologies across the organization, adopting things quickly. One of the big themes we have right now is accelerated adoption, which is, how can we, if you will, spike the curve on adoption so that we get it compressed to the shortest possible period of time.
So I had a question about sort of what are the trends that you expect to see in the future, and you sort of brought up a few of these actually, and I'm gonna give you my take, and then you can tell me how correct I am here. But it sounds like sort of what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years since the last downturn is sort of a prelude to what you're predicting will take place to this next decade. Like you said, the digital transformation is a buzzy topic. It's somewhat controversial. Big promises. The deliveries are sort of more nuanced, I think, than the broad marketing push of it. But what you're saying is that, in the next 10 years, a lot of this will come together and will really be the digital transformation will actually happen.
Yeah, I'm very confident that's the case, just observing what's happening inside our company. So one of the things which has worked really well for ConocoPhillips is we aren't looking at the digital transformation as something which only kind of digital workers coming out of university are going to be involved with. So this isn't just data scientists or people with degrees in computer science. A lot of our biggest successes, Trent, have been when we've been able to take our petroleum engineers and either one, they've kind of learned the skills to do some amount of data science themselves, or couple them with a data scientist to attack some of the more difficult problems. And some of the successes we've achieved have been just absolutely amazing. I can think of one where we looked at how do you optimize completions in unconventional reservoirs. And the tradition has been let's get bigger completions, more sand, more proppant, more fluid. Everything's getting larger and larger. But what we found was that when we actually went in and did some detailed data science work, bigger isn't always better depending on the conditions. So, it depends on the price of the products that we're selling. So, obviously, if you're at very high oil or gas prices, you want to get the most you can out of the entire reservoir. So you might move the wells closer together, put bigger completions in place. When prices are lower or costs are higher, you'll come up with a different plan. So we're starting to develop some deep insights on how to optimize our overall businesses, well plans, development plans for entire fields. And a lot of this is being done, as I said, by our petroleum engineers. So I think what's really going to make the digital transformation really, really effective as far as lowering cost of supply, having a bottom line impact, is that when we kind of can couple the kind of traditional technologies which we've been using in the industry with some of the insights you can get from digital.
Well, since you brought it up, a lot of the oil and gas world is wondering what happens to U.S. unconventionals. And so you brought up some of ConocoPhillips' work, which we've reported on here at JPT, some very compelling stuff. Before we got on, we were chatting a little bit about the test site work at the Eagle Ford that we wrote about and featured in December 2019. But what do you foresee? Can you unpack this and get a little bit more detailed on how you see well designs, development strategies changing? And then also the big question is are there any efficiencies left to drive out of the system? Or have we figured out 99% of it?
Yeah, it seems like every 25 to 50 years, someone comes along and says that, the world's discovered all the interesting technologies it can ever discover. And I can tell you for unconventionals, that's not the case. There's still a lot to be done. You mentioned the test site in the Eagle Ford. This is where we had drilled a series of development wells, hydraulically fractured them, and then drilled multiple test wells through the hydraulically fractured reservoir to acquire core data, log data, pressure data. We had fiber optics in some of the wells. So acquired an incredibly robust data set. And from that data set, we learned a lot about hydraulic fracturing. That's really helped inform the approaches we're taking today. I think there's still more to do in that space because there's only been a limited number of these test sites. We did the one in Eagle Ford. There was an industry consortium that did one out in the Midland Basin. There's one going on today in the Delaware Basin. But, we were just absolutely shocked by what we found, Trent. Basically the geometries that the textbooks and computer-based models said should be there weren't there as far as the hydraulic fracture network and, some of the characteristics of proppant distribution and particularly how the stimulated rock volume drains with time. So the pressure data has just been incredibly informative. So, we shared some of that at ERTEC, the Unconventional Resources Technology Conference, but there's more to do. We're actually looking at follow-up projects in that space. We're looking at, how do we use refracs to get more out of the reservoir? As I said, as it becomes more important to get to a lower and lower cost of supply, because if you believe oil prices may not recover to the level they were at as a result of the reduction in demand, you can start thinking about, okay, how do I change the development plan? So, I think there's a lot for our industry to learn in the unconventional space. Our experience has been, if you have rocks in the best part of the reservoir, in the sweet spots, if you will, you're going to be able to do things there that further lower cost of supply and basically make those types of opportunities more competitive. So I think unconventional reservoirs are going to be coming back, but they're going to be in a world which is very, very competitive. All the other asset types are trying to find ways to improve as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. It feels like there's been so much learned just in the past few years in the unconventional space, and it's you would hate to think that all that progress is going to be slowed down. And so to hear you speak, it sounds like there's still a lot of room for diagnostics and execution, and the industry has built up some of this new knowledge to where some of these experiments or decisions can actually now be a little bit cheaper to go forward with. But the topic of the day is COVID-19, and one of the it sort of dominated every aspect of our lives these days. But if you just go back to January and the months before January, the biggest theme in this industry was commitments to sustainability. So we're talking about lower emissions programs and zero carbon targets and lower carbon targets. This has been another question. Has COVID changed those priorities? Can you speak to that from ConocoPhillips' point of view?
Yeah, so you rightly mentioned that sustainability is something front and center for the industry, and that hasn't changed at all. And in fact, there's great technology stories developing in this space. Sustainability is a topic with a lot of different elements, and I might just highlight two of them. Greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane emissions from our facilities, wellheads, production systems, and also water sustainability. So if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, the industry has, for some period of time, been looking for ways to be able to monitor for methane emissions and do it, effectively. And this is a tough problem. I mean, methane is a colorless, odorless gas, and it's been hard to detect. But the advancements being made in sensor technology and some of the automation I was talking about earlier really has opened up some new capabilities that need to be able to exploit. So we're very excited about this. We're working with technology companies, looking at satellite detection, aircraft-mounted devices, devices you can put on drones, on vehicles you can drive around in the field. And also, perhaps really importantly, is mounting sensors in the facilities themselves. So we're hopeful that with these technology advancements, we're going to be able to get to a place where methane emissions are going to be able to be identified very quickly. And really importantly, to be quantified accurately enough that you'll know when you have a problem which needs immediate attention. So that's happening, and I think that's going to be a big, big advancement for the industry. The other thing I'd probably highlight, Trent, is that, frankly, the water side of the equation is one that's going to continue to get more and more attention. So, if you look at the Permian Basin, for example, very, very large amount of water being produced on a daily basis. Industry needs to find a way to manage that. We were being really proactive looking at recycling technology. We recently had one really fantastic story where I think it's a micro bubble flotation technology, which helps make the recycling process much more efficient and effective. Worked in the Permian. We were able to port that up to our Montney operations in Canada and get a good result there. So that ability to quickly transfer technologies around the company, find things that work, deploy them elsewhere, continue to help drive down cost of supply and improve the sustainability of our business. That's got to be the model going forward as we go into the 2020s here.
Well, thanks for that, Greg. I'm smiling a little bit because as you're talking, I'm reminding myself that these are some of the technologies that we've reported on in JPT. So no shameless plug. We're just the ones reporting it, but you guys are the ones doing it. So, before we get to the last question that I had for you, Greg, I just wanted to remind everybody to send in their questions. We're getting some good ones. I'm looking at them on another screen over here, but keep sending them in because we're about to get into the Q&A session before we wrap this chat up. But Greg, I wanted to come back to sort of the SPE and walk away a little bit from, sort of thinking about operations and technology, applications in that regard for E&P. What is your advice for SPE members who are faced with these challenging times? Should they be thinking about new skill sets? What is the most important thing that they should be doing to advance their careers during these challenging times?
Yeah. So when we look inside of ConocoPhillips, one of the things we are very aware of is that as we develop new capabilities, we're going to need the human capacity to utilize those capabilities. And as I said, the industry is evolving very quickly. So I'd say continuous learning, upskilling, if you will, is really going to be a focus for many companies, and really should be a focus for all of us. In the data analytics space, I mentioned that we're really trying to arm our petroleum engineers, our geoscientists, our business people with those skills, because we see them as being absolutely mission critical to being successful in the years ahead. Frankly, I'd ask all the SPE members to think about what can I do to become more digitally aware, work with more digital technologies. It's not to say that our traditional technologies, the reservoir engineering, the production engineering capabilities are diminished in value, but being able to couple digital with kind of those core technologies, I think that's really going to be the secret sauce as far as companies being able to continue to advance their ability to lower cost supply, get ahead of sustainability issues. And companies need those type of capabilities. It would make sense for the members to really focus their time and energy on developing those capabilities themselves.
Okay, well, thank you, Greg. I want to open it up to the Q&A session here. We have about, it looks like about 10 minutes for that. And so the first question that came through that I thought was pretty interesting takes us back to technology and keeps us in the digital realm. So, can you talk to us, Greg, about, what you think about producers embracing open data, open source tool sets to advance industry efficiency? This is something that we've seen take place in other industries. How is that going to work out in this one?
Yeah. So whoever asked that question obviously understands that the more data you have access to, the more likely it is you're going to be able to develop deep insights. So, I think one of the challenges for the industry is how do we go about sharing key data sets such that the industry as a whole can make advancements as quickly as practical. We are actually a fairly fractionated industry. I mean, if you compare us to most other industries on the planet, we have far more players in the industry than most others. So the ability to get access to data that allows you to see the bigger picture is going to be important. Some of the things we're investigating data sharing consortiums. We've got one going up in the Bakken with Woodmac, where they've got a collection of operators together who have agreed to share certain data that isn't in the public domain, so that all of the operators can get a better understanding of how to optimize well designs in the Bakken and best operate the wells. I think you're going to see more and more of that. You're seeing a lot of data gathering services, if you will. So, services that go about and gather up all the data in the public domain, some of them doing analytics on those, making those available to companies. So you don't necessarily need to be a big company to gain access to some of these tools and capabilities. But, the industry really does need to find ways to do this, because in the final analysis, we're not just competing with each other. We are competing with other sources of energy. And, frankly, we've got to keep driving down the cost of supply for oil and natural gas. I've used that term a lot. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's, the price you would need to receive for the sale of your product to get a 10% or higher rate of return, or at least that's the way we think about it. So if you drive down that cost supply point, you can make a good return at a lower and lower product price. And we think that's going to be the game that the winners are going to play in the 2020s.
Whenever low prices come back to this industry, certain segments of it suffer more than others. And so I had a couple of questions come in about the deep water sector, and then also EOR, because we know this is an area where, and I'm specifically referencing unconventionals or shale EOR here, which is something that takes us back to your technical work in the Eagle Ford. So can you comment on, how this next round of lower for longer affects those two segments of the business?
Yeah, so in the shale space, a number of companies are engaging in EOR projects, most of them in the Eagle Ford, but in some of the other plays, there's been efforts underway now for some time. We're seeing, I think the industry seeing some mixed results. I mean, the ones we've seen that have been successful, you've been able to contain the gas in a relatively small area. The ones that haven't worked so well, if you have a fracture network that extends across the basin, you just can't pump up the pressure in a small enough area to have an impact. So I think there's a lot of things yet to be done in that space. As with many other aspects of unconventional, a lot of the initial approaches to things like EOR have been let's take a technology we used in conventionals and see how it works on unconventionals. And perhaps the better question for unconventional EOR is, are there some alternative approaches that really are customized for the type of system you're dealing with there? In the deep water, ConocoPhillips pulled out a deep water exploration and development, several years ago now, almost half a decade ago. And that was really a part of this evolution of our overall technology strategy and our company strategy. As I said at the outset, 10 years ago, ConocoPhillips was looking at a number of challenged resources. Our peers around the industry were doing the same thing. People were looking at gas hydrates on the north slope of Alaska, developing oil offshore in the Arctic in areas where there was sea ice on the surface 6 to 9 months out of the year. Oil shale in Colorado, that's where the oil is locked in the rocks and has to be, you have to heat up the rocks in order to extract those oils. When we looked at deep water, we thought, that was going to be a relatively high cost of supply for them to be engaged in. So for our company, we made a strategic decision. That was a hard decision because ConocoPhillips has been in the offshore since the beginning. We went into the offshore right after World War II. When I joined the company, I joined Conoco in the early 80s. It was an offshore company. And of course, deep water today is the frontier in offshore. That's where most of the new big discoveries will be made. But we are really taking to heart this view that you need to have the lowest possible cost supply to be a winner in this industry. It's not to say there aren't going to be good deep water discoveries, and you look at some of the stuff like off Guyana, exceptional results. But we thought that overall it wasn't going to be a game we were going to want to play or be able to play effectively.
If we take things back to unconventionals for a second. There's been a lot of talk about pressure monitoring these days. This is something that we've reported on heavily at JPT because we're looking for, sort of that next evolutionary step, change, if you will. And the pathway leads to something called real-time fracturing or on-the-fly fracture design. This has been a big topic in the completions community because, especially amongst the engineers who are really striving to, improve these designs and lower capital costs for these wells, move us away from cookie cutter designs. Could you offer us some thoughts or a prediction on the future in this respect? Is real-time fracturing going to change the business in the next, several years?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, when you look at the capabilities that are being developed as far as sensing technology, automation, you start thinking about how can you apply that when you're pumping a hydraulic fracture away. We know that the rocks talk to us. The rocks tell us about what's happening downhole. It should influence how we, design, if you will, the fracture stimulation job. So, I think monitoring what's happening real time and then having the capabilities to understand based on what the sensors are telling us what we should do is going to be an area with a lot of opportunity ahead, Trent. The whole completion space, I think, has a lot of opportunity for automation, both on how you go about the mechanics of hydraulic fracturing as well as the downhole side of it. So perhaps drilling's a bit further ahead in that space. We've seen enormous advancements there. We've been so excited about that, but completions is following not too far behind.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. I've been waiting for other people to sort of raise the point that we've seen so much advancement on the real-time data acquisition and actionable insights and the drilling side. And yet that has not moved stepwise with completions. But now in the last year, we're really starting to see some concrete developments there that I think will be just as exciting as what we saw in the real-time drilling space.
Yeah, so we're working in a high-tech industry. Many people on the outside don't visualize it that way, but the technologies that are being deployed and the advancements those are creating are really amazing.
Well, Greg, I really appreciate you giving us a half an hour of your time now. We're going to wrap it up, but did you have any final thoughts on sort of, we talked a little bit about, some advice that you would give to the average SPE member, but was there a parting thought that you wanted to give everyone?
I hadn't thought about that beforehand, but I guess, if I was to pass on what I'm passing on to the ConocoPhillips employees, it's really to, continue to upskill your capabilities, stay focused on learning, developing and broadening your network and relationships, and then stay optimistic about the longer term future. This is an industry that goes through big ups and downs. We're in a down period right now, but the industry will come back stronger as long as we keep innovating and finding ways to improve upon what we do.
Well, thanks, Greg. We will be sure to keep our chins up. And to everyone watching, I want to thank you again for joining us on another SPE live broadcast. We're really happy to be bringing you these kind of programs and these interviews. We're going to keep doing so. So please keep tuning in and checking in on us on our social media platforms. With that, I want to say stay healthy and safe, and goodbye for now. Thanks again, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Trent.